On the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome to the program Domingo Morel. He's an assistant professor at Rutgers University, Newark, on his book, Takeover, Race, Education, and American Democracy, released on the Oxford University Press this year. Domingo, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me, Sam. Glad to be on.
Okay, so let's just place into context the process and the circumstances of what leads to the takeover, and we're talking about the state takeover of a local school district. In general, what's the process, and what are the circumstances that lend us to that situation?
Yeah. So there have been different iterations of state takeovers, but the policy of a state takeover really emerges in the 1980s, and they late 1980s out of this kind of accountability, kind of reform movement, based on the idea that schools that are not doing well, not performing well academically, or have financial issues, need to be taken over by their state governments in order to, A, produce better educational outcomes and have better management of the schools, financially and otherwise. And so this is starts to really happen in the 1980s. By the 1990s, 2000s, it picks up. And currently there's kind of a different type of takeover that we are starting to see happen now, with places like New Orleans and in Tennessee and so forth. We can talk about that at greater length later on, but that's what we start to see happen. And so again, it's an initiative, intervention based on the idea that the school districts are not doing what they need to be doing in producing the adequate education for their students.
Because it feels like there are a couple of different eras in which the takeovers operate, and let's start with the 80s in terms of when these laws first started to emerge. Because I think by the time we get to the 2000s, and we're talking about a place like New Orleans in particular, it becomes more of the privatization. The impetus seems to me, at least, to be somewhat based in privatization of schools and the sort of the introduction of charters and whatnot. And I wonder if, like, the 1980 laws were in some way a function of national politics or pushback on things like busing, or what was more specifically, I guess, the impetus for these laws when they first got on the books?
Yeah, and so what I argue in my book is that most of the attention has been on whether these types of takeovers actually produce the desirable educational outcomes, right? And what I'm trying to argue is that it's really a political imperative, and so that we need to look at not just education outcomes like test scores, graduation rates, and so forth, that we really need to understand how the politics of takeovers shape the idea of a takeover and the implications that come after that. And so by looking at it from a political perspective, then takeovers start to make a little bit more sense. And so particularly as they emerge in the 1980s. And so what I argue in the book is that by the 1960s and 1970s, we have this centralization of state power. And that centralization of state power is a result of what's happening at the national level in the 1960s and the local level, late 1960s. And so, as you know, and many of your listeners will know, by the 1960s, under Lyndon Johnson, the national level government is taking on these policies and passing legislation that has a pro-civil rights agenda. So that's, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. And in addition to all of that, we see under Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society programs, the expansion of dollars that go from the national government directly to cities in ways that we've never seen before in our history in the 1960s. And guess what? These dollars are going now to cities that are increasingly becoming majority Black and are increasingly led by African American leaders, and at the school board level, at the city council level, and eventually the mayoral level. And so there is a response to all of that by conservatives, which by the late 1960s, early 1970s are consolidating within the Republican Party. They find that their level of to gain influence and to gain power, it has to be at the state level, since we see what's happening at the national and we see what's happening at the local level. And so, many people are familiar with this new federalism that was, pushed by Nixon and then eventually expanded by Reagan, this idea that power was being decentralized from the national level to the state level. That was in response to that. And in addition, while that's happening, this devolution from federal power to state governments start to centralize power and start intervening in localities in ways they had never done before. And we see this happening most prominently with education. And education happened to be one of the few areas in the 1980s where actual funding to localities is increasing, right? And so this consolidation of power at the state level by conservatives is a response to that growth of Black political empowerment in cities, because Black political empowerment presented political challenges to these conservatives. And, what I write in the book, that there's two major challenges. One is that African Americans are gaining political power in cities, and they're becoming influential not only in cities, but in states, because of the heavy concentration of population in these central cities. And so that means that they have power not only in cities, but in their states. And in addition to that, these communities, in Black communities, they're making demands for more resources for their schools, and they're actually winning. They're winning court cases that lead to more funding. And so the conservative response to this is to intervene in schools, and takeovers only happen as a policy. So states start to pass takeover laws only after communities actually win court cases securing more resources, right? And so we don't get state takeovers of local school districts without that. We don't get first. Communities have to win, and this is again between the 1980 and 2000, that period that you're talking about, which in my book I call the incubation period of takeovers. These takeover laws only get passed after communities actually win these court cases. And so one of the interesting data points in the book is, between 1980 and 2000, there are 18 cases where plaintiffs win court cases to secure more resources, and in 14 out of those 18 cases, states pass takeover laws.
Wow!
The only states that don't pass takeover laws are Montana, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. And so I don't have to tell you what the percentage of Black residents is in these states, but they happen to be the whitest states in the country. And so takeover laws are passed in response to this. And so without this, and without Black political empowerment in cities, we actually don't get state takeovers of local school districts.
That's fascinating. And so, now let me just back up for a moment, because the argument, the thesis that you're making here is that it is inherently informed by race and by a racial dichotomy between power that is at the very least accessible to Black folk and to minorities in the urban centers, and this is a challenge to the authority of those in the state houses who, for the most part, tend to be white. Is there any data on the educational outcomes? I mean, so that we can, shift more to the sort of like the implications for democracy and the political power. Is there any data for educational outcomes? Like, is there any evidence out there that when a state takes over, you get these sort of dramatically better educational outcomes, which could possibly justify it?
Yeah. So to that question directly, so the results are mixed, and particularly the research that we saw happen during this period, again, the 1980s to early 2000s, it's really mixed. And so there's no conclusive evidence at this stage where takeovers actually lead to better outcomes. We can talk about, later research and so forth. But what I do want to make the point I think the major point here is that these school districts are clearly struggling. They have always struggled, and so I think that that's important for us to understand. But the research, what the research is pretty clear about, is that if we're going to improve school districts, we need collaboration. We need all hands on deck. We need the state to be invested. We need the national government to be invested. But a key component to all of this is that you can't eliminate the local community from the decision making. That just is not going to lead to better outcomes. And so, going back to your main question here, is that these districts clearly have struggled. And in fact, one of the main case studies in my book is the city of Newark. And so I argue, I show looking at historical account of the city of Newark in 1967. What most people call a riot, Newarkers actually call a rebellion, took place in Newark, where 23 people died. And the year after, the governor of the state of New Jersey commissioned a study, and that study pointed to all of the factors that led to this uprising in Newark. And one of the major factors were the schools. And the reports stated that, number one, you had a majority African-American population that had no political power when it came to the schools, and so that it needed to address that. That was one of the points of resentment. And number two, that the schools were dismal. They weren't. They didn't have the resources that they needed. The buildings were falling apart. They didn't have enough teachers. The dropout rate was over 30%, and most of all, that they didn't have enough seats for every Newark student to be able to attend the schools. And so this is in 1967, 1968. What the community decides to do as they gain political empowerment is to advocate for more resources and to do the kinds of things that they need to do to improve the schools. And it's precisely at the time that they're actually gaining the resources because of these court cases in the state of New Jersey that the state comes in and takes over the school district. And so I just want to be very clear that the argument here is that these school districts are, stellar and the takeovers are happening. No, these schools are struggling, but that the key to improving the school districts requires collaboration and requires effort from all parties, including the local communities, which they did. And they have continuously done. And it is, I argue in the book, it's precisely because they're doing the kinds of things that they need to be doing and fighting for their kids and fighting for more resources that it invites this types of intervention.
And so the intervention becomes a way to make sure that the resources are controlled by the right people.
That, and also,
depending on your perspective, I guess. And somebody locally would say the wrong people, but from the state's perspective, exactly. We don't have access. These are federal dollars. They're bypassing us. We want to be able to control how those are spent. And I think, go ahead.
So just to be clear, I just want to, because it's not really federal dollars, it's actually state dollars, which is critically important to the story here. Federal dollars only account for about 10% of local funding across the board. And so the increase in funding is actually coming from the state government, which kind of produces this resentment that we see by non-urban state legislators.
And it's funding that comes from the state, but it is mandated by, in the wake of a court order that's saying you're underfunding this, and states tend to have, and I wonder how much this is in play in these states that you talk about too. When you have a finite number of these takeovers, how many of these court orders are predicated on a state constitution that says the state has an obligation to educate all of its citizens?
Well, so in these court cases, again, going back to this period, the incubation period between 1980 and 2000, these court decisions, the courts are making these decisions based on their constitutions and saying that these schools need to be funding, the states need to be funding these schools adequately based on their constitution. So this is a critical part of it. And the first state where this happens is in New Jersey, becomes kind of like the model for other states to follow. And, I argue there's no surprise that because New Jersey becomes the first state to do this, based on what their constitution says, that it becomes the first state in the country to pass a state takeover law and the first state in the country to actually take over a school district in 1989, the Jersey City schools.
And you make the point in the book too that not only is this a question of maintaining control over resources, but that school boards tend to be the point of entry for people of color into politics because of, I guess, the localized nature. Is that what it is? What's going on there? Because I would just add that, we're seeing this, in about 3 or 4 red states that tend to be a little whiter, but we saw this in Chicago. It seems to me that teachers are and issues around education tend to have the ability to expand into other issues into the community, because I think a lot of educators will tell you that if we have, frankly, a poor community, a community living in poverty, the educational outcomes are going to be totally implicated by that.
Yeah. And so, when marginalized communities, and we're talking particularly here about African-American communities and Latino communities, when they don't have the access to, levers of political power, and we saw this particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, the path to political empowerment was the schools. So where they couldn't participate anywhere else, they were able to participate or try to influence school politics. And then eventually the path to political empowerment was paved through the schools. So before we had Black mayors and before we had Latino mayors, we've had Black and Latino city council members. And before we had Black and Latino city council members, we had Black and Latino school board members. And so that's the trajectory. And so political empowerment in these cities is through the schools. And so one of the major questions that I was, motivated my research was thinking about takeovers really as again, this political policy, and thinking about what types, knowing that the school boards and schools in general are critical parts of a community's political empowerment, how are takeovers affecting this? And with the research I find is that it's having an effect on school boards, but beyond school boards as well. It's having it's basically excluding people from the decision-making process. And once you take the foundation away from a community, which the schools serve as the political foundation of a community, then it has implications beyond the schools as well.